Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
Yeah, I want to make this point that, we in India are not an archival culture. We do not keep records and we do not keep memoirs and we do not make them easily accessible. So a number of the memoirs, some of these women wrote memoirs and letters and they are so inaccessible. I had to do so much digging to find them. I would say they're completely inaccessible to any ordinary Indian person who, for instance, does not have the time or the money to make a round of the various libraries in India.
Hello and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by the Bangalore International Centre. I'm Srikrishna and our guest today is author and journalist Kavitha Rao. Kavitha enjoys writing about human rights, development, social mores, culture and the arts, and as she puts it, all things Indian. Her latest book in that sense brings together all that she enjoys writing about. Lady Doctors, the untold stories of India's first women in medicine, is a compelling yet poignant read that profiles 6 Indian women who defied the odds and prevailing social norms of the late 19th and the early 20th century in order to study medicine. As Kavitha puts it, they were all fighters. They had plenty to fight. Upper caste Indian women got married when they were 10 or 12 years old and then hardly stepped out of their homes. Educating girls was considered unnecessary, and education in science and medicine far more so, and the latter not just in India but also in the West. These inspiring women have mostly been forgotten today, and Kavitha's book is changing that. How so? Why is that important? And what are the consequences is what we'll talk about today. Kavitha, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Like with a lot of things today, it all starts with Google, and you mentioned that's how it was for you as well. Do tell us the story behind the story. The journey, I'm guessing, was a short one, starting from your curiosity, leading to the belief that these stories have to be told now.
So it did start with a Google Doodle, as I've said before. In 2017, I went on Google and I saw this doodle celebrating the 153rd birthday of Rukmabai Raut. And I didn't know very much about her. I'd heard about her and I was a law graduate, so I'd also briefly studied her, but I couldn't remember much about her. So I did a bit of, research about early women doctors in India. And at the time, I was also reading this wonderful book called Inferior by Angela Saini, who is a British Indian writer, which described how women's stories have been sort of completely erased from science and completely forgotten because so many of the histories were written by men about men. And there was so much sort of, resentment and, resistance towards women in science. I mean, even Charles Darwin believed that women were not capable of doing science. So, combining these things together, I realized and, I strongly felt that these stories should be told. However, even though we don't have many material of them, but whatever we have, I felt that the story should be revealed to people who are interested in the journey of women in science and how difficult it was to get where they are today.
You come from a family of doctors, and what does the book and these stories really mean for women doctors in India today? How much do you sense we've progressed in removing these biases, perhaps?
I do come from a family of doctors. My father was a pediatrician, and so many women in my family are doctors. I don't want to sound very conceited when saying that this book will change everything and change a lot of things. I think, I'm really just sort of starting out on this journey. And I don't really want to claim that this book will make a huge difference. Having said that, a number of doctors in my family have contacted me and said that, they did not know about these stories and that they feel, really lucky to be born in this century and to realize that just about a century ago, it was so incredibly difficult for women to even enter medical colleges, forget, graduate and practice and all of that. So, the book has only been released on July 12th. So it's slowly picking up. And I am getting feedback from many women doctors who have found it very interesting. And some of them have said to me that yes, prejudice still continues in the profession against women doctors, and we have been pushed towards sort of female specialities like gynecology
Right.
and easy specialities like that. But there have also been doctors. There are also doctors in my family who are pursuing specialities such as cardiology and geriatrics, and
Mhm.
traditionally male sort of specialities. So I guess it's a mixed bag. I just hope that the book makes people think about, medicine is such a respected profession today for women.
Yeah.
It's considered, at least in, maybe perhaps in the South, perhaps in my community, it's considered that, a woman doctor, she's worthy of so much respect.
Yeah.
But it wasn't always this way. The early women doctors started out with absolutely no respect. And in fact, so much sort of vitriol and, hatred directed towards them. So it's important that people know about this journey.
And from what you're hearing from people that are reaching out to you after having read the book, what else are you sensing is resonating most, particularly for, I guess, women in general and women doctors in particular?
I think a number of women doctors are shocked by the stories in the book where a number of women doctors, both Western and Indian,
Mhm.
were denied gold medals, which they won rightfully.
Right. Right.
For instance, in the book, there's a Bengali doctor called Hemabati Sen who
Yep.
won a gold medal. And then, the boys in the class revolted, and they went on strike, and they threatened her life, and they threw stones, and, they did a number of unpleasant things. And eventually the gold medal was taken away from her, and she was given a cash prize instead. So a
Yes.
number of the people who wrote to me have been sort of shocked by this incident. They like, but how can that be? I mean, how can medals be taken away from women doctors, which they rightfully won, and given to men? But that was the way it was back then, because it was very important that the men not be threatened, and they be sort of, placated, so that the women could continue in their studies. That is one thing. The other thing that
Mhm.
many women people have been shocked by is that so many iconic people that we learn about in our textbooks, for instance,
Right.
Florence Nightingale,
Yeah.
she was against women doctors at the beginning, when they first emerged. Florence Nightingale was very against women doctors, and she believed that they would only make mediocre doctors, and she believed that women were better suited to nursing, because she believed that the feminine qualities that women have is suited to nursing and not to
Right.
the study of science. And it seems that she did change her mind, because by the time Kadambini Ganguly came along, which was
Mhm.
some 20, 25 years later,
Later. Yeah.
she seemed to praise her.
Mm.
So it's hard to know what her journey was, but she seems to have changed her mind. And indeed, many people did change their minds. But also, a lot of people were astonished to know that Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who we always venerate as a great man in our textbooks, and who indeed was a great man. I'm not taking
Absolutely.
anything away from Tilak's greatness.
Yep.
But it's just that history is very complicated. Nobody is black or white. And
Yeah.
as we are all human and we all have our faults. And Tilak's, fault, if was in recognizing that women can do science. He believed that women are not fit for science, and that
Right.
they should learn, needlework and cookery and Sanskrit, and they should be educated, but only up to a certain point.
Mhm.
And he was a very conservative in the area of women's education. And one could say that, oh, well, you can't judge him by the standards of today. But the fact is that many of his colleagues and contemporaries were
Mhm.
far more progressive,
Yeah.
such as, Gokhale, the
Yeah.
Phules, especially the
Yeah.
Phules,
Yeah.
Agarkar, were
Mhm.
all much more progressive, and believed that women could be educated in science, and
Mhm.
believed that everybody should, every girl, regardless of their caste, should have a right to, the best education that could be provided.
True. True.
So this was another thing that many people, that has shocked many people, because
Right.
the history that we learn in school
Yeah.
is entirely black and white. This person is good, this person is bad. But in real life, it's a lot more complicated.
And I think for me, the other aspect which stood out again when you look at contemporaries back then and inspirational women back then, what one remembers the most ends up being Sarojini Naidu, perhaps, or Rani, Jhansi Ki Rani, and
Yes,
women that played a role in the freedom struggle.
true.
And it only makes you wonder, had these stories stayed through and received the same reverence as some of the others have, we would perhaps have more women leaders that we could all of us could be drawing inspiration from. And I wondered if that's something that obviously you've talked about it. Are you sensing that come through as well from what you're hearing from people?
Yeah, I want to make this point that, we in India are not an archival culture. We do not keep records and
Yeah.
we do not keep memoirs and we do not make them easily accessible.
Hmm.
So, a number of the memoirs, some of these women wrote memoirs and letters, and they are so inaccessible. I had to do so much digging to find them. I would say they're completely inaccessible to any ordinary Indian person who, for instance, does not have the time or the money to make a round of the various libraries in India.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of them, like Muthulakshmi Reddy, wrote two autobiographies. One of them I could trace only overseas
Hmm.
in the library of the University of British Columbia in Canada.
Huh.
Through a Canadian friend who went there, xeroxed it, and all 500 pages or whatever of it, and sent it
Yeah.
to me in a
Yeah.
PDF file.
Hmm.
I'm very grateful to her for doing this. But so this is what I mean.
Yeah.
And for instance, Hemabati Sen wrote a fantastic memoir which remained forgotten for over 100 years and lay at the bottom of a trunk. And
Right.
nobody thought that it was important. They thought it was the scribblings of some, woman, some unimportant woman. And it was only translated from the Bangla in 2011, some,
Which is literally 10 years ago.
120
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
after she wrote it.
Hmm.
And then it was published by Rowley. But when
Hmm.
I wrote this book, even that book was out of print. It's come back into
Wow.
print now. So that is a fantastic memoir called Because I'm a Woman by
Hmm.
Hemabati Sen. So I just want to make the point that so many of these, perhaps the reason why we only know about, Sarojini Naidu and Jhansi Ki Rani and all these
Right.
people is because there is, we haven't taken the trouble to keep any of these memoirs and letters on record. That was an immensely frustrating aspect of doing this book. I could find, so little material. Because of that, I had to leave out some doctors, and the chapters on some doctors are thinner than on other doctors, mainly because of that. So yes, as you said, a
Hmm.
number of people who have been writing to me have said that, oh, wow, I went to Calcutta Medical College and I graduated from Calcutta Medical College, but I never knew anything
New.
about Kadambini Ganguly
Mm.
because none of us were told anything about her. So I'm hoping that this will make people kind of, dig further and look further. And there are still so many women that I have not covered because obviously I had to restrict it to, a set number
Sure.
of women.
Sure.
So I'm hoping more is unearthed about these women as well.
No, indeed. I think all of us would hope for that. You talked about some of the frustrations of that you went through as you wrote the book, or as this all came together for you. Could you perhaps share some anecdotes or fun memories that have stayed with you through writing this book? I know one, of course, this is something that you wrote through the pandemic.
Yes.
So that itself, I know, will is a fun memory for for lack of a better word. But are there other things that have stayed with you, Kavitha?
The pandemic wasn't exactly fun because all the libraries sort of closed down.
Right.
And I found it very difficult to keep
No.
going in the pandemic. I'm sure all of us are
Yeah.
going through that phase
Yeah.
where we
Yeah.
sort of wonder, what is it all for? I mean, I kept thinking, I mean, who will even kind of read this book? I think, just before the pandemic, I had the privilege of meeting Dr. V. Shanta, who
Right.
worked with one of the doctors
Yeah.
who was a chairperson of the Adyar Cancer Institute. And
Right.
very unfortunately, she passed away early this year. So she
Mm.
has not seen this book. I wish, this book had come out when she was live.
Right.
And I don't know about fun, but it, and this is going to sound a bit corny, but it was so inspirational meeting her because
Mm.
Dr. V. Shanta, she was a peer of, not peer, but, junior of Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, who
Right.
founded the Cancer
Yeah.
Institute.
Yeah.
And, she's mentioned in this book. She was
Yeah.
one of the few people who had living memories of the lady doctors.
Right.
And it was so incredibly inspirational because she lives in two rooms above
Mhm.
the cancer hospital.
Right.
Two, not very luxurious rooms, just, filled with all her memories, her medals, her photographs, her, her letters, all her memoirs of this time. And, when she spoke to me and she said that when I was a young girl, I listened to Jawaharlal Nehru give that speech when
Yeah.
India became independent.
Yeah.
When the clock strikes, this is not an exact quote, when the clock strikes, India will awake to life and freedom.
Yeah.
That's a rough quote.
Yeah.
She said, I was so inspired. And, from that day, I decided that I'm going to devote my life to medicine and more particularly oncology, because at the time, nobody was interested in oncology.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps our generation and perhaps many people listening to this
Mhm.
have lost, idealism and, courage and, fire. But when I met her, she's a Gandhian. The Gandhians had so much fire and so much idealism and so much energy. And when I met her, she was 95. She passed away at 95. And she still had that energy. She was still doing, admin work and organizing, the functioning of the Cancer Institute.
And she had become synonymous with the institute for a lot of us.
Yeah, I found it very inspiring. So I don't know whether you would say it's fun, but I just found when I met her, this was just at the beginning of the pandemic, and the next week the pandemic hit. I met her March 8th. I remember very clearly, March 8th, 2020. Then after that, the pandemic hit and it just went on. And I was like, why am I even writing this book? Maybe I should just focus on staying alive and keeping my family alive. But I just felt after meeting her, that I felt that, she was so interested in this book. And I felt that these stories should be told. Somebody should read them. So
no, I'm sure there are a lot of people reading them for sure. And for me as well, Muthulakshmi Reddy's story was the most interesting. We'll come to that in just a bit. The other thread I did want to pick up on was you talked about the fact that the gold medal, where men opposed the fact that it was going to be given to Hemabati, and there was protest. To me, that's sort of a theme that stays through in every story, which is the encouragement of supportive men that all these 6 doctors got, be it their fathers or their husbands. But as one sort of reads through the book and the support from the men in the family, it ends up appearing to be a bit of a mixed bag. What do you make of that contradiction? And I think, it seems like, beyond the family, the men were an impediment, really.
Indian society is very complicated. I mean, I think that's the understatement of the century, right?
Right.
Marriage is so often a very mixed bag for women. And so it was for the lady doctors. The first lady doctor, Anandibai, was encouraged by her husband to study. In fact, the amazing thing is that he used to beat her for cooking. If she was cooking and not studying, he used to beat her. So he was an abusive husband. At the same time, he was also very encouraging of her attempt to study. And simultaneously, once she actually went overseas to Philadelphia to study, he suddenly got very insecure and tried to grab her limelight and was very controlling and all that. So, marriage for her was a constant juggling act. This same pattern was repeated with many of the lady doctors. For instance, Hemabati Sen, she was a child widow. Her first husband died only 2 years after she was married. It was a very unpleasant experience for her because she was only 9 years old when she was married. And then her second husband was a wastrel. So she had to work simply in order to keep the family going. And then Rukmabai, of course, she is famous for, she was so unwilling to be married to her husband, and that she, went to court to divorce him. She stood up against the Hindu conservatives, including Tilak.
Right.
She was vilified for, divorcing her husband. And for later 2 doctors, their husbands were more supportive because society had moved on a bit.
Right, yeah.
But then even Muthulakshmi Reddy writes clearly in her autobiography, she says that, I advise all medical women not to get married because it's impossible to devote your time to the study of medicine if you have to also look after a husband and children.
Yeah.
So, it was a very mixed bag for them. And they had this constant pressure, and I don't think that pressure has abated in any way, of having to look after the children and the husband and the in-laws and their, look after their practices and persuade, people to come to them. So it was a very mixed bag for them. While the men were supportive in many ways, and in other ways they were not. And I have this feeling that many of them would have preferred to go it alone. Certainly Rukmabai Raut, for instance, after she returned to India from her study overseas, she never married again. And she devoted herself to her practicing for 40 years in Surat on her own. And in fact, she was, as written in, by her biographer, she was also very, discouraging of, romantic relationships in her family. She was like, don't even bother kind of thing, So she wanted to go it alone, and she succeeded in going it alone, which at that time was a huge achievement, I think.
There were a few things that stood out. For example, I think in one of the correspondence that Andibai writes to the lady who eventually takes care of her in the US, and I think before getting there, they play a game, and what's the what word comes to mind when certain phrases are put out. And for benevolent, she says husband. And the fact that she writes so many letters, she wrote so many letters to him pretty much every week, I think, right? Even after going to the US. And you wonder how that is what does it tell of the relationship where on the one side there is encouragement and there is support, and a lot of it is because of the husband or the father. But at the same time, you're also putting up with a lot that is really uncalled for. And as you were narrating this, I do wonder, how much of that has really changed and how much hasn't, even today, right?
Yeah, I'm sure a lot has changed. I mean, Anandabai had a very complicated relationship with her husband because it is, you can see from the letters that he was everything to her. He was her friend, philosopher, guide, mentor, everything.
Yeah.
And she loved him. At the same time, she was being physically abused by him.
Yeah.
So this is a very sort of complicated pattern. But that was how life was in those days for women.
Yeah.
Okay. And perhaps, for so many women, even today.
Even now,
Yeah. So it's a very complicated relationship and cannot be easily categorized in any way as, in this way or that way or whatever. So it's complex.
For me, the other, I guess, recurring element in each of the fascinating stories is the fact that the women were, eventually they were not just doctors. They shaped a lot of the prevailing discourse at that time. They stoked social reform, be it Rukmabai Raut or Kadambini Ganguly, and of course even Muthulakshmi Reddy.
Yes.
What do we make of that, and what's your sense of, what did that involve?
Yes, I think without exception, every lady doctor believed that she had a larger social responsibility. And that may seem, strange to us now, where, many of us just focus on ourselves and our families. But in those times, they honestly were very idealistic. And this was not sort of, a sham that they put on. It was, they strongly believed in social responsibility. And as you mentioned, both Muthulakshmi and Mary Poonon Lucas took a very active part. They were both legislators. Mary was the first Indian legislator. Muthulakshmi was the second by just a couple of years.
Right.
And they both felt strongly that there can be no progress in India until the concerns of women and children are addressed. Because you have to remember back then, in the early 1920s, and, no one was talking about women and children. Their concerns were assumed to be the same as that of men. The freedom struggle was going on, and many of the stalwarts in favor of the freedom struggle, like Gandhi and even Tilak, they did not believe in legislative reform. They believed that reform should be brought about by social change,
Right.
And people like Muthulakshmi Reddy, stormed onto the scene, and she was impatient with all of this. She says quite rightly that, if we are waiting for change to come, it'll never come. Social change to come, it'll never come. She says quite frankly and openly, and this is what made Muthulakshmi, such a great woman. She was so frank and open about this. She says in her memoir that, all these men, they stride on stage and, they strut about saying, oh, well, we're against child marriage. And then they go home and marry off their children at the age of 9.
Right. Yep.
So she said, without legislation, we cannot change this. And she believed that the only thing that could change it was legislation. Yes, it would not be 100% effective, but it's a start. And therefore, she pushed very strongly for legislation that would, enable women and the concerns of women and children, to be addressed. For instance, she was instrumental in winning the right to vote for Indian women. She was instrumental in raising the age of marriage for women. And, she fought for all these concerns because she believed that was her duty as a woman legislator. Okay. And, she strongly believed in legislation and solve these problems. And Mary was the same. She fought in the Legislative Assembly. Her concerns were more towards the medical side because she was instrumental in setting up the state of Kerala's public health program at that time.
Yep.
Mary fought for, the improvement of hygiene, the setting up of, more nurses, the setting up of midwife schemes in every state. And, in what I think is one of the most relevant and important chapters in my book, which is very relevant to us today as we battle COVID, she spoke out very strongly in favor of compulsory vaccination for smallpox.
Right. Yep.
Because she believed that, at the time there was a smallpox epidemic raging through Travancore.
Yeah.
And Mary believed very strongly that whether you believe in vaccination or not, whether you think it inconveniences you or not, society has to pull together to eradicate these highly contagious airborne.
Airborne
And
it was, yes.
yes,
Yeah.
smallpox is airborne.
Yeah.
And just like COVID. And
Yeah.
she believed very strongly that, anti-vaxxers and the vaccine reluctant should not be allowed to dictate the agenda. And now
Right.
we see in countries over the world, they're coming to that realization, not in
Yeah.
India, because we
Yeah.
don't even have enough of the vaccine.
Right.
But in the US, whatever progress they have achieved is threatening to be derailed by the 30% of people who have not taken the vaccine. And Mary was so ahead of her time in fighting strongly for vaccination, fighting strongly for modern medicine, and not, homeopathy and Ayurveda, which was popular at the time.
Right.
Most of these lady doctors believed very strongly in the public good and in the public over the individual good. You may be an individual person who believes in, doesn't want to take the vaccination, but you do not have a right to, overthrow the public good. So in that, they were ahead of their time. So.
And I think even from a institution building standpoint, again, Muthulakshmi Reddy's story really stood out for me. One, of course, the whole Gandhian influence on her, and she in turn being able to influence social reform across a range of topics, including her crusade against the Devdasi practice. And you talked about child marriage as well, and also the institution building work that she did both with the Adyar Cancer Institute and with the Avai Home. Tell us a little about what you came across, and you do talk about this in the book, but would love to hear your insights, particularly on her crusade against the Devdasi practice.
Yes, I'm glad to talk about Muthulakshmi because in my interview so far, people have focused on the first three doctors.
Sure.
And it is true that, Muthulakshmi is an incredibly interesting woman, and the chapter on her is meaty because she wrote 2 memoirs.
Right. Yep.
She took the time to sit down and write those memoirs, and the picture that emerges is of a very confident woman. Some of the other lady doctors were a little less confident, a little more sort of, but the picture that emerges, perhaps because of her father's influence on her, is that she is extremely confident, and she was not a woman who had many doubts. She believed in the rightness of her goals, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. The Devdasi, her stance against the in favor of the Devdasi abolition bill is quite complicated because Muthulakshmi's mother was a Devdasi woman from the Sai Velar sect in Tamil Nadu, and her father was a Brahmin. And to the end of her days, even in her memoirs, she never mentions her mother's caste. She talks a lot about her mother, including how her mother was not keen on her studying and was keen to marry her off, and and therefore her constant fights with her mother and her aunts, her maternal aunts. But she does not talk about this. And even when I spoke with Dr. B. Shanta, she told me that, Muthulakshmi never mentioned her caste. And of course, we didn't ask. We proceeded with, life as, administering the hospital.
Correct.
And I feel that she did not mention it because she was afraid of, the terrible discrimination she would face. And she did face discrimination initially. When she tried to enter the Maharaja's college, there was a letter written by the college saying we should not allow this girl because she is from a lower caste. Okay. And, but somehow the Maharaja of Pudukottai, as you pointed out, intervened.
Yes.
And he was a very interesting character, and he intervened on her behalf, and she got admission. And after that, it doesn't seem to have been much of a problem from what she writes. Okay. She just sort of steamrolled ahead. She was a very dynamic woman. She wasn't someone to sit around doubting herself. So this sort of kind of complete belief in her own, in the rightness of her own actions carried on when she moved for, to abolish the custom, the Devdasi custom. And of course, in many ways, she was completely right because the Devdasi system was a terrible system. And as Muthulakshmi said, it condemned girls and, to prostitution and enslaved them. But Muthulakshmi, she would say that there is absolutely no opposition to my position on this. There is no opposition from the Devdasis, but there was opposition from the Devdasis. As I say in my book, there was a very accomplished woman called Bangalore Nagaratnama,
who's quite a well-known singer and Carnatic
Yes, who
musician.
was
Yeah.
a very well-known singer, Carnatic musician, extremely well-educated,
Yeah.
and even a
Yeah.
translator,
Mhm.
a very sort of Renaissance woman in the old-fashioned sense of the
Yeah.
term.
Yeah.
And she was strongly, opposed Muthulakshmi's stance. She said, you cannot condemn all Devadasis on the grounds that they were prostitutes and concubines. Yes,
Mhm.
many have fallen, into those traits simply
Yeah.
because no support has been
Yeah.
provided for them.
Economic reasons.
Yeah, economic reasons. And in those days the Devdasis were the custodians of the arts and and dance, particularly Bharatanatyam.
Yes.
And what happened, after Muthulakshmi, sort of steamrolled ahead, and she
Mhm.
didn't like the Devdasis to speak out for themselves. She believed that, women like her, respectable women, highly educated women, Gandhian women were the ideal. And this was what was believed in the times when India was becoming newly independent. The Gandhian woman was the ideal for,
Right.
as this is the kind of woman who should be in public life, highly educated, respectably married,
Mm.
and that kind of thing. And so she believed quite strongly that hers was the only way. And I think in modern times, many commentators have called Muthulakshmi's stance a bit patronizing and
Mhm.
elitist,
Mhm.
and perhaps that came from her background. But
Yeah.
what eventually happened was that the Devdasi system was abolished by legislation, and which
Right.
was pushed forward by Muthulakshmi eventually after a
Yeah.
lot of resistance.
Yep.
And the system sort of slowly died out after many years. I mean, though it still prevails in
True.
pockets.
True. It does.
Yeah. So this was at what eventually happened. And it's a complicated and situation, and I hope I have covered it adequately in my book. There are other books which have covered this in even more detail.
Right. No, and I think similarly, even with Mary Lucas as well, and again, this sort of moves into the early 1900s with both of them. And Mary Lucas went on to becoming the world's first woman Surgeon General. How much do you think things changed from Anandibai to Mary Lucas, and whether things that perhaps got easier in Muthulakshmi's time and Mary Lucas's time?
Yes, as I say in my book, I mean, Mary was certainly the first Surgeon General of India. I say that she is possibly the first Surgeon General, first woman Surgeon General, I mean,
Right. Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah.
But I could be wrong. I just haven't found any
Anyone
research
else? Yeah.
that talks about a woman Surgeon General anywhere else.
Yeah.
I mean,
Until
even
1990 or something. You mentioned that.
no,
Yeah.
no. Even in the US, I think in the 1960s, Antonia Novello became the first woman Surgeon General in the
Right.
US.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I assume there weren't any others.
Mhm.
So yes, they were certainly. I think this book shows a journey. This is why I was
Yeah.
keen to include Mary Poonen Lucas,
Mhm.
because I think it shows a huge sort of circle. Anandibai Joshi, she was an 18-year-old girl. I
Yeah.
mean, we forget. I mean, she died at the age of 22.
Right.
And when
Just
she
a few
entered,
years after she graduated, or
exactly,
just about when she graduated.
yes,
Yeah.
when she entered medical school, she was 18. She died at the age of 22, very
Right.
sadly.
Yeah.
And she did not have the time to develop or practice her her medical profession.
Mhm.
And she was very much in favor of traditional Indian medicine, Ayurveda, and things like that, which was not really, sort of peer reviewed or anything, because in those times, they didn't really have that. And by the time we came to Mary Poonen Lucas, who had the privilege of being educated in the UK and who
Mhm.
was deeply influenced by British hospitals,
Yeah.
Mary was extremely in favor of modern medicine. She spoke out quite strongly against Ayurveda and homeopathy, and the reason being, which is the reason I also believe in. I'm
Yeah.
also a very strong believer in modern medicine.
Yeah.
She said, at the time, Travancore state, people did not go to doctors. That is,
The Western medicine,
medicine trained doctors.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
would go, first of all, they would not go to any doctors until the situation was so severe that, possibly no doctor could cure it.
Right.
And secondly, they would normally go to the local healer,
Right.
and who would usually be, a quack, as Dr. Theodore Somervell, who was a
Yeah.
contemporary of Mary, calls it.
Right.
And they would end up with terrifically, awful medical situations. I mean,
Mhm.
as detailed in the book, there was a girl who refused to go to a doctor, and she went to the local healer, and he put chili paste on her eye for an eye problem, and then she went blind.
Right. Yeah.
And there was so many people who died in horrific circumstances because they would go to these local healers. And Mary saw this, and therefore she said that many of these local healers are not trained in medicine.
Mhm.
They're not trained in anatomy. They're not trained in physiology, and therefore the state should be encouraging properly trained doctors. Not necessarily people who have gone to the UK, but even
Right.
say people who have gone to the institutions in India. But she was shouted down by all these male legislators because as one of them said, why do we need more doctors in Kerala state?
Yeah.
Doctors just cause problems. And in those days people actually believed that the more doctors we have, the worse it's going to be for people. This was in
Right.
newly independent I mean, not even independent India. This was in the 1920s, when we barely had any doctors in India. So quite rightly, Mary thought that this was nonsense. But she didn't always prevail, and there has continued to be a state support for homeopathy and Ayurveda, which I, for one, find completely reprehensible. I think that the state support for the Ayush ministry at a time when the only way we are emerging from this hell around us is from the
Is
COVID vaccine.
science. Yeah.
Yeah, it's science. We should be concentrating on getting the vaccine into everybody and not talking about homeopathic remedies for the vaccine. I mean, I'm very clear on that. I'm sure that might enrage some listeners. However, I and Mary Poonan Lucas are of the same mind on that. So
And you talked about this earlier on as well, the fact that there isn't as much of archival and the way we operate here in India. Do you think that there are perhaps other women whose stories will never be known simply because there's very little documentary evidence? You do mention
yes,
Motibai Kapadia and Jerusha Jirad in your book.
yes,
There's a
there
reference.
are so many women whose stories I could not find enough about. I
Mhm.
mean, one woman that I would have liked to cover is a woman called Hilda Lazarus, who was the first Indian, head of the CMC Vellore,
Right. You
which of
mentioned
course
that.
in South India is like, like
Yeah,
a holy grail for many of us.
it is. Yes.
To be honest, this was affected a lot by the pandemic,
Mhm.
because I had this plan of going to CMC Vellore and
Mhm.
finding the records and tracing the records, but I just couldn't, because the pandemic continued and continued and continued, and everything, travel was very difficult.
Right.
And maybe somebody else can write a book about her, and I could not find as many sources about her as some of the other doctors. Okay.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that is in Hilda Lazarus is definitely a big omission.
Right.
Okay. And as you say, Jerusha Girard and Jagannathan, she was another
Yeah.
amazing woman. And then there was Motibai Kapadia, whom literally I could find one line about.
Wow.
Even when it's like, and I have mentioned many of these in my epilogue, because
Yes.
I wanted to be known that this book is not comprehensive. And
Right.
and I guess no book can be comprehensive, because if we
Yeah.
include all this, it'll become something like 800 pages long, which is not practical. you
Mhm.
know there are just so many women. So I did choose some of the women whom I found had interesting anecdotes. There's also Rani Rajwade, Malini Suktankar,
Mhm.
Dosibai Dadobai, who all played an immense role in, early, when India was newly independent, in setting up all these sort of institutions and helping more women enter, the medical profession. These were all sort of mentors. Uh, as I said in the book, one would mentor the other.
Through your research and as you've been spending time and thought on putting this together, has this sparked off thinking on perhaps what next is it that you would like to be writing about, Kavita?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, like, a lot of people have asked me that, and I know it sounds really pathetic, but I just want the pandemic to be over and to endure it
As do all of us.
yeah, to end it in some sort of manner.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I can even think about other things, because my family is divided because of travel restrictions.
Right. Yeah.
So I can't go home and they can't visit me. So I have a lot on my plate at the moment.
Mhm.
I'm hoping that the pandemic will ease. The thing is that I would like to write another non-fiction book because I think perhaps non-fiction of this kind appeals to readers, and perhaps and now that I have done this one, but it is an incredibly expensive proposition. When Indian readers ask why there are not great non-fiction books, and why, for instance, William Dalrymple wrote so many books and other people came along so many years later and not to the extent that he did.
Sure.
I'm sorry to say that, foreigners have a huge privilege. One, because they have access to libraries. And now that I am in London, I now have that privilege.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But even then, it's incredibly expensive. All these books, like I got an advance and I bought some books out of that advance.
Right.
But all these books are incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
They just are incredibly expensive because these are all, textbooks and PhD theses. And
True.
I only managed to save some money because I wrote directly to the people who have written these books. And I honestly asked them, I said, look, I'm an Indian writer writing this book on not much of budget. Would you mind just sending me a copy of this book?
Yeah.
And some of them were kind enough to send me a PDF copy.
Got
and, so I had to appeal to many people's charity, and that's not always available to everybody. So this is the reason why more nonfiction is not written, because it's an immensely expensive and time-consuming proposition. But yes, I would like to write more nonfiction because I think this is a golden era for Indian nonfiction. I think there's a huge interest in reading Indian histories which are written by Indians. And it should not always be that our histories are written by foreigners. I think there are many Indian writers, some of whom you've probably had in your podcast, Ramchandra Guha, Manu Pillai, Ira Mukherjee, Narayani Basu, all who can write beautiful, Anita Anand, she's a British Indian writer, who can write beautiful history about our own, people. So I hope to do that.
And we look forward to that. I mean, I've really enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you.
I want to end by going back to the introduction of the book. It is a sad commentary that we don't remember these women until now, and we still perhaps don't know all that there is to know. And I really think that your book changes that. But in many ways, a lot of what went on then continues even today. How do you see these stories and you're bringing them back to the fore sort of impact the India of today that we live in, Kavitha?
I would hope that at least some of them can be in our textbooks, because the fact is that I meet, I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm very active on Twitter and on other social media. I see so many young Indian men saying, oh, well, it's only when men have distinguished themselves in science. Women really haven't done anything. And, let's call a spade a spade. If we want to be politically correct, it's the fact that women have not achieved much in science except for Marie Curie. And I just want to make this point that the reason they have not achieved anything in science is because of all the impediments that were thrown in their way. Very and true. Also because of so many stories that were forgotten. I mean, who remembers Mary Poonon Lucas as the person who started, put into place the system of Kerala healthcare? And she wasn't alone in that, but she did do her part. So I would just hope that they enter our textbooks. Perhaps a road can be named after them. Perhaps we can have statues. Perhaps we can have museums. I mean, for instance, Rukmabai Raut's old house in Mumbai, which is near Girgaon Chowpatty, is still there.
Okay.
Somebody could even do a tour or at least kind of look to the preservation of this house. So many of these things are still there, and Kadambini Ganguly's old house is still there. So I strongly feel like, I hope that they are brought back into our minds in some way. I mean, it shouldn't take Google Doodle to celebrate these women.
True, and
they should be
naming a crater on Venus doesn't really help either.
Correct. They should. I strongly feel that they should be in our textbooks next to C.V. Raman and Jagdish Chandra Bose and Homi Bhabha, because I think they have contributed as much as have these men, and they've had far greater challenges to overcome. So, I really hope there are more histories written like this about, Indian women in science and in medicine.
No, we all hope so too. Kavitha, thank you for writing this book and bringing out what these inspiring women went through in their lives and what they stood for. And thank you for joining us on BIC Talks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.